In this lecture, we're going to add a field for connecting the enemy with their path. At the moment, the enemy and their paths are not connected. The enemy's path is in a completely separate game object. We chose not to add the game object as a child to the enemy to prevent the path from moving while the enemy is moving. However, this leads to the problem of them not being connected. We can easily connect the object by creating a field. Let's give that a try. First, let's create a component for adding patrolling behavior. Not all enemies can patrol the area. Technically, we could write the patrolling behavior from the enemy controller. However, that would mean that all enemies can patrol the map. Rather than adding the logic directly to the enemy controller, we should create a separate component that can be added as needed. In the scripts/character folder, add a new C# script called patrol. Next, let's add this component to our enemy. In the characters folder, open the patrol prefab. Unlike the other components, we're not going to apply this component to the enemy base prefab. Otherwise, all enemies will have patrolling logic, which we don't want. It should only apply to specific enemies. Under the inspector, add the patrol component. After adding this component, we're ready to start editing the class. Open the patrol class from Visual Studio Code. Let's clean up the class. Firstly, remove the system namespace from the class. Next, remove the start and awake methods from the class. Above the class, define a namespace called rpg.character. Lastly, move the class into the namespace. This class will be responsible for accepting the path. We'll store the path as a variable. Define a private variable called spline GameObject. Its type will be GameObject. The path should be modifiable through the Unity editor. So why aren't we setting the modifier to public? This variable won't be accessed outside the script. I don't think it makes sense for it to be a public variable. At the same time, it cannot be updated through the Unity editor unless the modifier is set to public. Fortunately, Unity has a solution for giving us the best of both worlds. Before the variable definition, add an attribute called serializeField. This attribute was introduced to address our specific problem. We may not always want to set a variable to be public to prevent it from being manipulated by another class. We can continue to use the private modifier while allowing others to modify the variable's value from the Unity editor. Let's head on over to Unity. Under the inspector, the variable appears as an editable field. Fantastic! Let's start adding our paths to their respective enemies. Switch over to the scene. From the hierarchy, select the first enemy. Under the inspector, click on the field to open a list of game objects. Select the Scene tab. If you were to select an object from the Assets tab, our enemy wouldn't be able to find the path. Make sure you're selecting an object from the correct tab. Next, search for the path that will be attached to this enemy. For my project, I called the path Patrol Path 1. Your enemy may be using a different path. Be sure to select the correct path. Otherwise, you may get unexpected behavior. Select the game object. After selecting the game object, let's repeat these steps for the other enemies. I'm going to quickly add the paths to my patrol guards. After adding all paths, we're ready to start making them walk on the paths. The main takeaway from this lecture is understanding how Unity treats your variables. Most beginners don't understand when to create a variable as public or private, or when to use attributes. Let's address the thought process you should go through for defining your variables. The first question you should ask yourself is the following. Does the variable need to be accessed outside of the class? If yes, set the modifier to public. Otherwise, leave it as a private field. After answering this question, the next step is to ask yourself two questions. Should the variable be modifiable through the editor, and is it private? If the answer to both questions is yes, add the serialized field attribute. Lastly, ask yourself the following question for a public field. Should the variable be hidden from the Unity editor? If yes, add the non-serialized attribute. After answering these questions, you should be able to know when to use public or private variables. In the next lecture, let's start adding a state for patrolling the map.